Pastor Chad Bresson, pastor of the Table of Los Fresnos, and on this channel, I also happen to be Brad's brother. This is Rhythms of Grace for this Tuesday, and February is quickly drawing to a close. I don't even know where January went. Now I don't know where February. It feels like it was just Christmas. And we're about to embark on March here. It's hard to believe. A lot of my head throughout most of this day, or at least part of the day, has been in the book of Ruth. And Ruth is a book that we find in the Old Testament. It's a short book. We're typically used to thinking about it being a love story, or even that we're told as a love story. I think if we emphasize Ruth as a love story, that's probably really missing the point of a lot of what's going on in this book, and we'll get to that in a second. But it's just a fascinating book. It's a short book. It's also a book that I have found helps us understand a lot of the Old Testament in the way we read it, and some of the things that the author is doing helps us with our interpretation, helps us read our Bibles better if we read the rest of the Bible the way the author of Ruth is wanting us to read that particular story. Then we get some help along the way in understanding what's going on in the entire Old Testament. But the book of Ruth is most likely a defense of David's throne. There were always questions about King David. You pick up on this as you read the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, or the book of Samuel as it is in the Jewish Bible, and in Chronicles, and a little bit in Kings as well. There's always this rivalry between and Saul. So who has the legitimate right to the Samuel? But along the way, there are questions, especially from Saul's house and Saul's family. Hey, Ruth, probably Nathan, writes, okay, here's how David has a legitimate claim to the throne. And it's the story of David's background, David's family. Where did David's family come from? And the funny thing is, along the way, then the author, again, if it's Nathan, he's giving us an upside down way of doing it. It's not how we would write our own story. If we were writing a defense of our right to the throne, I doubt that we would put a lot of things in Ruth that are in there. In fact, we might not even write the book. You see, Ruth has a lot of things going on that make us uncomfortable once we stop and think about them. That's why I said it's not always good to think about Ruth as a love story. Ruth occurs during the days of the judges, and in the book of Judges, we're told making up their own rules. They got their own sense of morality, and that comes through loud and clear in the book of Judges. The book of Ruth is that leaves Israel, and they go to Moab, which was one of Israel's rivals. And he sells his land. That becomes apparent as the story unfolds. He sells land, which was a no-no. You weren't supposed to sell your land, even in famine. And might not have necessarily been improper to go to Moab to look for food. But what Elimelech does is he sells his land. He obviously buys property in Moab and then builds his life there. And that is obvious. We're supposed to see that negatively as this story opens. Well, Elimelech in Moab dies. They end up, they build a home, they raise a family, they have boys, the boys get married, and they marry 2 Moabite girls. And Elimelech dies, and then the 2 husbands die. One of the daughter-in-laws, she stays behind. Ruth, one of the daughter-in-law, is going to follow Naomi, who was the wife of Elimelech. She's going to follow Naomi back to Israel. Once I get to Bethlehem, by the way, that's where they are from. That's also part of this story. I don't know what I'm going to do when I get to Bethlehem. What am I, I don't have any land I can find there. She finds a family member, a distant family member, or at least one that's not so close. His name is Boaz. He becomes part of the story. Ruth follows her to Bethlehem, and along the way, Ruth is beginning to, and then is portrayed throughout the book as someone who isn't Israel. In fact, she's kind of an indictment. Because the way Ruth talks, the way she acts, is the way Israel isn't. Elimelech is doing what is right in his own eyes. He is Israel in this story. Ruth is what Israel should be doing, but they aren't. But she's a Moabite. Oh, we have a Gentile who is voicing the covenantal formula. The covenantal formula is, I will be your God and you will be my people. Well, it's on her lips as she heads back to Bethlehem with Naomi. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. That's a variation on that covenantal formula. So we got Ruth acting as if she's an Israelite. The end of the book, I'm going to fast forward all the way to the end of the book, really have no future. But Boaz steps in and, to pass the property on. I mean, once Naomi is gone, looking on the inside, they're going to be cut off from the covenant. I mean, that's how dire this whole thing is if you're cut off from the covenant, you're cut off from God, period. Boaz steps in, and in an act of redemption, redeems the land. And he, remember how I said this isn't your typical love story. He actually purchases Ruth. We don't like talking about that too much in our culture, but yeah, it's there in the story. He purchases Ruth. The whole thing is grace. But there's more going on than simply Boaz stepping in as a redeemer. And by the way, that is a picture of Jesus. And we talk about the book of Ruth and everybody's, oh yes, Boaz, that's the picture of Jesus. He's the one who basically rescues the whole story. And it's not Boaz. We see the grand redemption into the covenant once again. As this whole thing is winding down, Hope, she's the one holding the new child of Boaz and Ruth. His name is Obed. And the women who are singing around Naomi are singing the praises of Obed. They call Obed Naomi's redeemer. And so there you have this great, grand picture of redemption and grace. Someone who is born, it's a miracle birth, because as you get into the book, it looks like Naomi has no shot at being in the covenant. And yet here's this. There's even more grace here. In fact, the whole thing is totally upside down. They are the products of the incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. So, we have Lot's daughters being pulled into this grand story of redemption. Now, that's the first one. And then, as Boaz is redeeming Naomi and Ruth, here at the end in chapter 4, the townspeople are singing. There's songs being sung in this last chapter that are totally interesting. But the lyrics of this particular song are talking about Tamar. If you know anything about Tamar, go to the book of Genesis. Just look her up. See what she does to be included in the grand story of redemption. So you have Lot's daughters, you have Tamar, and then, oh, by the way, Boaz is related to, is either a great-grandson, great-grandson, or great-great-grandson of Rahab. Oh, okay. So we have Tamar, we have Rahab, we have Lot's daughters, all in this grand story of redemption. If you're writing a defense of David's throne, are you going to include these characters? Probably not. What's interesting is they get included in Jesus' genealogy. Matthew brings all of them into his story of the birth of Jesus. All that to say is God is constantly using In fact, that's all he does, is use broken people. All he does is grace. It's grace upon grace. In fact, in the story of Ruth, he is being gracious in order to give grace. It's almost like he's doubling over on his grace. In a gracious act of redemption, he has this story of Boaz and Ruth, and Boaz purchasing land and a people in a gracious act. But then there's Obed. This birth, this gracious birth, all through Lot's daughters, Tamar and Rahab. That's grace. That's grace. And that means there's hope for Bresson. There's so much hope here. Because God is still doing that. He's still using the broken. He is still using in grace to accomplish grace, to give grace, to proclaim grace, to talk about grace. Rhythms of grace for today. Hope you're having a great Tuesday. Hope you have a great rest of your week. Looking at what's going on there from afar. And again, I hope